Hi everyone, welcome to our discussion about the communication and signaling between cells. Cells are fundamental units of life that perform the processes that allow all organisms to survive. Regardless of whether an organism is unicellular, like bacteria, or multicellular, like human beings, cells need to communicate with one another. In the case of bacteria, individual cells communicate to form biofilms, which are aggregations of bacteria that form on some surfaces such as our teeth. In the case of multicellular organisms like human beings, there are trillions of cells. Between these trillions of cells are numerous communication pathways that allow the human body to operate properly. The general pathway of cell signaling that enables cells to communicate with one another involves three main steps. First, a signaling molecule binds to a cell surface receptor or intracellular receptor, which changes the conformation of the receptor protein. Next, the receptor protein initiates a signal transduction pathway. A signal transduction pathway converts and transmits the message from the signaling molecule through a series of changes in relay molecules. Many times, the original signal is amplified through the signal transduction pathway. The last step is when these relay molecules elicit a response by activating certain effector proteins, such as metabolic enzymes or transcription factors. In the human body, cell signaling can occur over short or long distances. For example, neurotransmitters can bind to a metabotropic receptor on a postsynaptic neuron. This type of short-distance signaling activates a signal transduction pathway. However, endocrine glands also secrete hormones into the bloodstream to produce a response from other cells. For example, when the human body is stressed, the adrenal glands can secrete a hormone called epinephrine, also referred to as adrenaline, which causes the liver to release glucose. Glucose can then be used by the body to provide it with an additional energy. Cells are programmed to react in a certain way to extracellular signals. Apoptosis, which is genetically programmed cell death, is activated by a signal transduction pathway. Cytokines, which are small proteins secreted by immune cells, activate other immune cells to aid in an immune response.
So we've talked about how cells communicate in a broad sense, but what exactly do these signaling molecules bind to, and how do they elicit a specific response in cells? Well, it begins with receptors. Generally speaking, there are three main classes of cell surface receptor proteins. They are ion-channeled coupled receptors, G-protein coupled receptors, and enzyme coupled receptors. Ion channel receptors or ionotropic receptors are generally involved in rapid signaling, such as between nerve cells. In order to create a signal, neurotransmitters bind to receptors, which causes receptor proteins to become more or less permeable to certain ions. When this occurs, the concentration of ions within the cells increases, and depolarization, where an electrical signal can be sent to the next cell, or hyperpolarization, where an electrical signal is stopped, can occur. G-protein coupled receptors are a little bit different though, as G-proteins act indirectly to transmit a signal to cells. In these processes, a signal molecule binds to an inactive receptor, causing it to then be activated. Once activated, the receptor activates a G-protein by substituting the GDP that is bound to the G-protein for a GTP, or a guanine triphosphate. Now, the G-protein can bind to an enzyme to cause a cellular response. For instance, angiotensin, a blood pressure regulating hormone, is used in such a pathway to cause some cells to contract and increase blood pressure. With enzyme-coupled receptors, signaling can occur in a much more simple way. Signal molecules just have to bind to transmembrane proteins, which are also enzymes, and directly cause the activation of them. Or they can bind to enzyme-associated receptors, which then bind to signal molecules and cause the activation of enzymes. These receptors that I mentioned before are only primary messengers. Sometimes when signals need to be transmitted, secondary messengers such as cyclic AMP or calcium ions are necessary. These are produced in large quantities when receptors are activated by signal molecules and diffuse throughout cells to cause a response. Other messengers are instead proteins, which activate other signaling molecules or proteins or effector proteins until a response is achieved. For instance, protein kinase adds phosphate groups to signaling proteins, thereby activating them, and protein phosphatase, which removes these phosphate groups, does the opposite. The process of protein kinases phosphorylating each other is known as a phosphorylation cascade, and eventually is completed when a protein kinase activates an effector protein such as a transcription factor, which causes a response in a cell.